Just got a couple more entering and then we will get going. Thank you for all for patience and for joining us. And we realise that in our scheduling, we did organise this for the school during the school holidays. And also for those who have joined us from different time zones, I know that it's mightn't be as convenient as it is for us here in Australia, but we really appreciate everyone coming in. So we might get going now that we've got David has also joined me. So welcome again. Thank everybody again for joining us. Like I said, I do really appreciate those who have come outside of the time zone we have here in Australia to join us for this session. For those who haven't met me before, my name is Andrew Bloye, and I'm the Managing Director and Co-Founder of ClearXP. We're joined today as well by my co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of the business, David Johnson. So we're massive fans of xAPI, and we have been using it actively since its inception back in 2010. And we've embraced it to the point where we base our entire product and our company is based on the infrastructure that utilizes xAPI. So we thought we would love to share our experiences and our insight into xAPI. So we prepared this webinar to share a deeper understanding with the broader learning and development industry to try and help you gain an understanding of it. We found that over the years, there is quite a big interest in xAPI, but possibly there are challenges or people aren't implementing it or adopting it as widely as it could be. So we're here to share our experiences, both from a high level and conceptual view of how it can be adopted, but then also going to go into a little bit more detail and talk about how physically some of the tools and some of the concepts can be used and how you physically can start using xAPI from a technical perspective. So I'll start off with the basics and give an overview of xAPI, and then I'll hand over to David, and he's going to go into some more nitty-gritty details and go into some more of the fine tuning of how xAPI is being used. We'll also go into some of the topics that we've had people ask us and people send through feedback and comments about the types of things I'd like to learn. And then we'll get a gauge from the group about some of the things we might like to go deeper into. As we go through, we want people to be able to either through chat or through calling out a question when we pause. But we'd like to hear from you in terms of any questions or feedback that you might have as we go through. The chat is fairly available to anybody who wants to put in a question as we go along. And then also when we pause, call out your questions or put your hand up and we'll make sure that we get to any questions that are happening. So just an overview and a recap of TinCan or xAPI. So it was released in 2010 and initially referred to as Project TinCan. They called it TinCan because of the two-way communication as per the little TinCan diagram here. It was intended to be an update on the previous SCORM version. So the previous version being SCORM 2004 version 2. But the idea was to make a fundamental change on how learning experiences are tracked. So Rastisi put a lot of research into how this could be achieved with the e-learning standardization and data. And they were aware that over the years between a SCORM update and when they were wanting to incorporate TinCan, the environment has changed around them. There had been decades since they've been updated. The technology had changed. The approach to learning has changed. So So the idea was to create a standard that captures e-learning experiences effectively and utilizes and marries all the technological advances that had occurred. So that had done so, and now they referred to it as, started off as Project Tin Can, and then it expanded into the Experience API and xAPI as we call it now. So this is a diagram that is on the Restisi website or the SCORM.com website that they used back in the day. But it's a really good representation of the ideology around xAPI, having the learner in the center and then capturing all the learning experiences that are happening all around them, things that can have any time and come from a variety of sources and methods. So the idea was to move away from the more static nature and the way that people interact with an LMS and a SCORM and SCORM objects, and move into a much broader, wider, and more visible model centered around the learner. So for us, we saw this as being a really big shift and a game changer. We had previously, David and myself, had to adjust or change or even abandon certain programs and delivery mechanisms that we were trying to do. For those who don't know us, again, back in the early days, we were content developers and we worked with a lot of interactive style learning objects and learning materials. And the barrier that we encountered was often that an LMS and a SCORM object wasn't able to be able to just deploy and effectively track the type of really immersive e-learning that we were trying to do. So we saw xAPI as a great opportunity to be able to really adopt more advanced technologies, but it also, we could see it how it provides a really holistic view of all the learning that's going on as well. Not only does it do that, but it still has the standardization and governance that are really important when wanting to do online training. Particularly nowadays, there's such a focus on data and security. So xAPI data allows you to store a great deal of data all securely in one location, and also often reduces the needs for multiple platforms and ways that you can be exposed to risk. So the shift from SCORM to xAPI, essentially what we're talking about is previously there would be an LMS and you can retrieve basic data about a user interaction being sent through from a SCORM object through to xAPI, where we are now receiving multiple points of data or statements. Dave will talk about statements a little bit later. Statements of data that can be received into a central point called a learning record store, or LRS. So the shift between what SCORM was doing and what xAPI were doing was quite monumental. And we saw there being quite a lot of advantages that come along with it. So static learning experiences versus the dynamic learning experiences that xAPI can provide. So with SCORM, the course is usually developed, especially these days, by using an external authoring tool of some description. Then the content is packaged as a SCORM package and uploaded onto an LMS, which is fine. It's been a tried and true method, and it's still the most common method used these days for authoring and publishing content. But you're limited to the static content that it is. The content exists as it was published, and then doing any updating or any changes, or even if you're wanting to do some more elaborate interactions, you're still limited by the package. xAPI allows content to be tracked with the same levels of assurance as SCORM, but it has a much wider variety of activities that don't come necessarily through a traditional SCORM package. So it could be stuff that's coming through from a website or intranet pages that has xAPI code associated with it. It could be interactions that people are having with content libraries, learning experiences from a whole range of different kinds of endpoints. So SCORM really has a limited amount of, gives you a static experience and limits your ability to be able to broaden those, but xAPI gives you dynamic learning experiences. As we mentioned, SCORM is reliant entirely on having a learning management system that has internet access at all times. If you don't have internet access, then you can't really access the content. So with xAPI, you're able to have content that is accessed through a web browser or anything that has any form of internet access. But you can also have it accessing content through a native app, or even you can even track content that's happening on a local computer on your own desktop. And then at some point, if there's internet connection occurring at a later stage, you can sync up the data that way. So again, xAPI opens up a world of different opportunities that you're no longer having to rely on an LMS having that constant internet access. Then the last one, in terms of what the obvious differences that we found are, have been the amount of data, and it's a really huge one. And again, we'll cover this in more detail with Dave a bit later. But obviously with SCORM, you can have completion records and names and dates and times that you can glean from a SCORM object in an LMS. You can also use suspend data to be able to save some of the information. But with xAPI, the options are really almost unlimited. There's obviously still a standardization involved, and there is some rules that you need to adhere to, but the data that you can glean from xAPI opens up a whole world of possibilities in terms of what can be achieved with the data. So when we talk about the types of things that can be achieved as well, we're talking about the types of things that your learners can access and the touch points that they can have to access. Touch points is often something you think about when you're talking about customer service, but we see learners and how they're able to access content and access learning. Touch points is a really valuable way of thinking about the types of things that is possible when embracing and using xAPI. So just for some examples, we're doing this now, and others are already sort of tapping into the possibilities that are available using a more advanced technology such as virtual reality and simulation softwares and augmented reality software. So some of the limitations previously, especially if you're doing a very immersive virtual reality simulation, is that you've got the technology you need, you've got the headsets, all those types of things you need that often don't align themselves well to uploading a SCORM file onto an LMS. xAPI provides a beautiful solution for being able to track the data. And similarly with augmented reality, often you need to make it work really, really well, you need to be using an app or a native app in order to be able to track using AR. xAPI works really well with that technology and helps you be able to track a whole range of data effectively using the AR technology. Doing more traditional style learning, facilitator-led training, whether it be online or face-to-face, but xAPI can really help you utilize some data by doing things like surveys or quizzes or evaluations, collecting them all as statements, attendance records. You can have people scanning QR codes, all those types of things. So there's a lot of ways that you can implement and get data that previously has been more difficult, as well as, documents and documentations and compliance. xAPI allows you to be able to collect data on things like even just like a sign off or checklists, being able to track the relationship between an employee and a manager sign off, those types of things. The way that xAPI treats data and treats activities allows for a much more wide and varied ways of collecting data. Something that we really like and we're big fans of in terms of being able to track and do some more engaging style learning. gamification and social learning are some really great engagement methods. With xAPI, you can go quite deep and you can get really granular data about what's occurring, and that gives you some great insights into types of things that you can track. The social relationships between people, not just necessarily social media, but just interactions people have together. Communication can be tracked and be more granular, and that gives some really valuable insights in terms of the data that you can achieve. And then enhancing some existing training. So taking an existing SCORM file, for example, and being able to track more data that is possible from SCORM is a really good use case of xAPI, and it's a way that many get started with it. One of the questions we've had was the relationship between xAPI and SCORM. The two, obviously, they're interconnected and related because they come from the same place. xAPI is just a more elaborate version of what SCORM is. So by default, a SCORM object will give you certain data, but xAPI wrapper around that will give you even more data that you're able to glean from some existing training. And then also, I mentioned it earlier, being able to track what's occurring on a web page or any type of object that has internet access, as opposed to being only available through an LMS, provides a whole advantages as well. Okay, so the last point for me at the moment is the point about being able to then align this back to data. So we've got all these touch points that are enabled by embracing and using xAPI data, and xAPI, but then being able to translate that back into data and then actionable data, so you can actually do something with that, being a really key defining step to success. So with us, and I'm sure anybody who's worked with xAPI is aware that you do get a lot of data. Like so far, I think the last time I spoke to Dave, the count was up over 500 million statements we've collected so far. It's probably more now, but there's a lot of data that is collected. So the key is to be able to make sense of it. So we look at it from two perspectives. So because you can collect all the data yourself. So just collect bulk amounts of data based upon what happening with your learners and the experiences and what's occurring in your learning ecosystem. And then retrospectively, you can apply. Nowadays, it's made much easier, but using artificial intelligence algorithms to analyze the data you've got and identify some trends and patterns that could potentially give you some really valuable insights into what's happening. So collecting the bulk lot of data and then analyzing that to see what is happening. But you can also be more proactive with your approach, and that is where you would have certain theories or hypotheses about what you think is happening or what you're wanting to see happen, and then you can set up your data touch points and set up your statements to be able to provide you evidence and support your theories about what is happening. So it's a more structured way of finding out if you're getting the engagement or the progress or the sentiment or any other kind of indicators that you're looking for as to what's happening within your organization. xAPI data gives you the power to be able to look into that more deeply. So from mine, that's my overview and backup. The next step we're going to take is I'm going to call on David to go into some of these points and go a little more deeply. At this stage, are there any questions based upon just those first elements that we've discovered? Okay, so 1 second.
All right, I will take over from here. No one has any questions. Everyone already has everything under control. Right.
I explained it so well.
Here we go. All right, so I'm gonna go into a bit more technical detail on some of the components of xAPI and how it works. So hopefully everyone can follow along. If it gets too nitty gritty, just shout out and I can peel it back a bit. But starting with statements, it's just the core data point that makes up xAPI. Everything we collect is a statement. So I'll just quickly cover what that looks like and kind of how sophisticated it can get. So if you're somewhat familiar with xAPI, you probably already know that a statement is made up of these three components: an actor, a verb, and an object. So this is what I call the minimum viable statement. You need to have these three fields. It's basically the bare bones of what you can collect. It's someone doing something. And this is your building blocks on the data that you can collect for xAPI. You have a lot of variability in the verbs that you can track. The actor is obviously the person, although it can also be a group of users if you want to track a group of people doing things together. And then the object is really anything that is like the thing that is happening, right? Or that you're doing against. So it's very wide in what you can track as the object. And you can even track things which aren't activities. You see, I say usually an activity. So I'll get into that in a bit as well. So elaborating on the basic statement, you can add a result. So this is if someone's answered a question or completed a course, you can start to track whether they were completing it successfully, the score that they had, the responses they put in, that kind of level of detail. So you start to have a sense of correctness over someone doing something. Now, completion and success are two different fields. And that's interesting because you could actually complete something and fail it. And you can track that separately to someone completing something and it not having a level of pass or fail versus someone completing something successfully. And so that's already splitting your data points into multiple different facets, and they all have slightly different meanings depending on what you're interested in. Score is something which is pretty arbitrary. It's up to the learning activity to define what that range is. So when you track a score, you can say it's out of 100, as this example is, but it could also be infinitely large. You could say it's out of like thousands, or it could just be a value between 0 and 1, or a value between -1,000 to 50. It's up to the learning activity to define what that scale of what a score is and make it meaningful to that data that you collect. So Andrew attended the masterclass, you completed it successfully, you had a score of 95. You got it, you almost got there, Andrew. You could have done a little bit better there. Things get a little bit more sophisticated when you add something called a context. So context provides information about where this statement occurred in the grander scheme of things. So for example, the masterclass that you guys are all attending now, it could be part of a larger course called Advanced xAPI. So that way, when we collect this data, we know that it's just one piece of the puzzle and that there could be a lot more going on here. We know what it pertains to. It provides a bit of supplementary information around the event that has taken place. I've also included the ILT here as a category. You can include category on a context as kind of like a tagging, additional tag, which it's not a direct relationship to the activity that has taken place, but it's more like a way to kind of slice another data point across multiple different activities that aren't like underneath the same umbrella. So virtual instructor-led training, for example, is something that could happen as part of this webinar, or it could happen as part of some other workshop, or completely unrelated activities. And if you wanted to report on that as a whole, you could then just narrow in on that category and see everything that's happening as part of virtual instructor-led training. So context is quite useful and actually extremely important for kind of classifying how this data is collected and like under what setting. And I think it's something that's often overlooked when people do start to experiment with xAPI and start sending their own data. Expanding on that, you can have extensions. So those 5 fields, active verb, object, result, context, were all mandatory fields, all predefined and what you can have in there. Extensions now just opens up the possibility to what you want to collect to any arbitrary value and data structure you can think of, right? It's your imagination is the limits. So I've extended this statement by giving masterclass a type. Type's not actually an extension, but it is an optional field on an activity. So the masterclass is a webinar, and we're giving it the activity and extension of duration equals 60 minutes. So duration is not a standard field. This is an extension that we're adding to the masterclass activity to give some indication, like some metadata about what masterclass, like some properties of the masterclass, such as how long it takes. It could be anything else. Like the metadata could include things such as like the topics it covers, maybe like the mode of delivery, or really like and this is the beauty of extensions, is it can cover anything. It could include the date the masterclass was first launched and how long it will run for, that kind of thing. Results can also have extensions. So if you wanted to report on some kind of measure of success or how Andrew went in the masterclass, that wasn't necessarily fitted in nicely into that score or like response field, you could have a result extension. And we use this for tracking things like whether this is his first attempt at the masterclass or the skills and competencies that he developed while doing it. So I've got a writing skill there. So again, this is kind of me defining what I want to capture with xAPI. So I want to capture that by undertaking this masterclass, he's also developed his writing skills by 0.8 on like a 0 to 1 grade scale. So these result extensions just allow you to like have another series of metrics that measure like how Andrew performed in this activity that took place. Context, again, can have an extension. And we often use this for things like the device that he used to access it. I don't think he's actually using mobile right now, but had he joined the masterclass through his mobile, we could capture that in a context extension. And we also use it for capturing other like not kind of success measures, like other kind of data points which might provide supplementary information to the event that took place that isn't really something which is correct or incorrect. And so again, your imagination is the limit when you look at extensions, but the word of warning is like, don't go too crazy on it. If you start just like coming up with completely random stuff, it just makes your reporting challenge much more difficult. Andrew, I think there's a message in the chat for letting someone in from the lobby. Can you take care of that? Assume you've got it.
Sorry, before you move on, David, you're host, you need to do that.
Oh, I need to do that. Oh my God. I'm failing. Where do I go to? Oh yeah, I got it. Technology, see, I can figure it out.
Yeah. David, I don't know what the statement would be.
I admitted Linda from the lobby.
David admitted Linda in the Zoom. Yeah.
Continuing on. Sorry, Linda, I only just saw the message. Continuing on with the extensions, I'm going to peel it back a little bit because this is already becoming quite a rich statement. If we take it back to those basic 5 core fields, you can also add a timestamp. And the timestamp is worth talking about because if you don't include it, the LRS, which collects the statement, will just assume it happens at that point in time. So it will basically attach the statement for you. So if I was to say, Andrew attended xAPI Masterclass, it would happen. And then I sent that statement to the LRS, it would happen immediately as soon as it was received. Now, for something like attending a masterclass, that doesn't actually always happen the time the statement is sent. Like the masterclass actually took place 35 minutes ago, or maybe you captured it at the end of the masterclass. So that's when you would want to include a timestamp to really kind of narrow in on this specific time that this event took place. And once you have that in there, you can start to do some pretty complex things. So moving on to the next one. You can do this kind of, we call this a sub-statement, and this is a statement within a statement. So Andrew attended the masterclass, but maybe that wasn't captured automatically. Maybe I had to mark him as attended. And so this could happen next week. I could go in and I look at everyone who joins this Zoom call, and I can go into the LRS and I can say, all right, Andrew did attend the masterclass, and I think he provides some good feedback. So I'm going to give him a response of great effort. And I performed this marking exercise as an instructor on April 21st, but the actual event took place on April 13th. So now we have this like extremely rich statement, which has two actors at play here. It's me marking Andrew as having done something else. And this is just something that is quite simply not possible in SCORM. Like back with SCORM, everything was completely isolated to the learner. They were running in their own little sandbox environment. There was no way to have one person interacting with another and capturing that in the data. So it's a pretty novel improvement in terms of what we can capture from learning, and it completely blows open the realms of possibilities of reporting. If you imagine this is an attendance scenario, but if you imagine this was something like a 180 or 360 assessment, we can start to look at who's a harsher grader of their peers, who's a harsher manager when they review their employees, just by looking at the person and who they're grading, and starting to slice those data in different directions. So it's something which has existed in xAPI right from the very beginning, but I have very rarely seen used in practice, aside from our own internal use of it. And I think it's something that can be utilized much more heavily. Does everyone follow along with that? Are there any questions? No, again, I've explained it perfectly.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do now is we've got a few different things we can talk about, and I kind of want to get some direction from the people in the webinar to know what they want to learn more about. So I'm going to pop up a poll and just have a vote of of these topics which you want to hear more about. So I've just popped up the poll. There's packaging and launching xAPI. So this is like, how do you actually deliver an xAPI module? It might not be clear to some people. How do you want more details in writing statements? So I won't go too, I've already kind of covered statements a fair bit. So that's more like practical information, how you would approach the topic, or defining activities, because activities can be quite broad. Do you guys want to know more about like how you pick your activities and what they can encompass? I'll give you a minute or so to respond, and then we'll tick off hopefully one or two of those if we've got time. Defining activities is winning.
I voted for that one too. Can vote. I'll point out to the group that we'll follow up after this if there's something that we haven't covered in this particular session. This is something that we're wanting to do. We're wanting to spread the word of xAPI. We just see this as a beneficial tool to people. So we'll follow up with the group individually as well. And if there's something that we haven't covered, but you didn't feel like this is the forum, you wanted to chat about it, that's no problem. You can contact with us at a later date.
Of course, we're always happy to help. All right, I think we've got some pretty comprehensive results here.
Oh.
I don't know, does everyone see the results?
You got to share them, I think.
Yeah, I'll share results. Here we go. So defining activities and packaging, launching xAPI. No one wants to know how to write statements.
You just showed us.
Disappointing. That's all good. So yeah, I'll just do that. I'll do packaging and launching first because it's a little bit simpler, and then we'll go into defining activities. So xAPI packaging. So xAPI is kind of unique from SCORM in that content doesn't have to be bundled and loaded to an LMS, but often that is how it is packaged. So let me just show an example from the authoring tool. So when you publish something, I think it's from Storyline, you kind of have different options. And one of these options here is LRS configuration. Now, what this wants you to do is to basically like hard code in the endpoint for your LRS, like where that server exists, as well as the user who's going to be accessing the content and some authentication credentials. I don't recommend this. You really don't want to do this because it means that that package is only going to work against that LRS and it's only going to work for that specific user. The credentials are baked into the package. Anyone who launched that would be tracking data against Maria. So when you see these options in authoring tools, don't tick them. What you actually want to do is you want to bundle it as a standalone package that can be loaded on any LRS. So the package itself looks a little bit like this. Now this is Rustici's launch mechanism. They kind of came up with this approach. I should say that loading xAPI modules is not something that is included in the specification. So this is a bit of like a supplementary piece of information on how do you actually start. How do you initiate the communication between some learning platform and an xAPI module? And so Rustici came up with this method, and it's based very similar to how you load a SCORM module. You have a zip file, which includes all the web resources, as well as like a XML metadata file. SCORM has a similar kind of thing. They call it a manifest file. The big difference between xAPI and SCORM here is that these web resources, they're all optional. You don't actually need to include them. With SCORM, you have to load everything onto the LMS. It all lives in that one location. Whereas with xAPI, you only need that metadata file. You only need to say, hey, this is some xAPI content that we're going to load to the learning platform and say exists somewhere out there, and it tells you where to find it. So that metadata file, it looks a little bit like this. This is a bit of code here. Hopefully you can read it. Effectively, what you have is the structure of xAPI activities that you want to import into the learning platform. They have IDs to uniquely identify them. They can optionally have types. They should have a name, otherwise you're going to have an unnamed activity on your system. It's going to be hard to find again. But the most important part is that bit down in the center, which is the launch URL. So the metadata tells us where to find that content. And so this is obviously where it differs from SCORM. The launch would be relative to the package, and it can be relative to the package. You can upload an xAPI module, which is all fully self-contained, and there's like a launch index.html file or some other HTML file there, which opens up. But in this case, the xAPI masterclass, we're running it from Zoom. So we can put in a URL there, which points at Zoom. And so that way, all that actually exists on your learning platform is just a pointer to somewhere else in the web. And that's kind of the power of xAPI, because now we're not constrained by the technologies that the LMS has. We can really track anything and it can live anywhere. So when that launches, what happens is a user will log into their learning platform. They'll be like, I want to access the xAPI masterclass. They'll click that link and it will direct them to that launch URL that we loaded. And it's going to pass through a bunch of details. And it's going to say, hey, this is the LRS we want to track to. This is the user who's launching it. This is the ID. And it usually will match what was in the metadata file. It doesn't always have to, because sometimes you can make duplicates, clones with different IDs. And here's some authentication details that tells us, like, it basically authorizes Andrew as a way to collect statements back to that source. So it's all done through this launch mechanism. And once that's happened, you can start that information has been passed on to the learning content, and that can now basically do with it whatever it wants. So for example, you don't need to continue on web. You could switch to a mobile app like that. That URL we've directed to could just be a proxy to open up a native app on your phone, or it could direct to some other device and pass through that communication details so you can continue in VR or some other kind of something that we haven't even thought of yet. And that's effectively like how xAPI starts, like how that initiates the process between LRS and content. Any questions on that one? Nope, all good.
Could I just, sorry, it's me though. Maybe, I know our audience is pretty broad. I know there's a couple who definitely know what an LRS is. Could you quickly just define the LRS as opposed to LMS, just for any of those who have joined us, because I didn't cover it in mine, exactly what an LRS is doing compared to an LMS.
Yeah, for sure. And I also carefully used the word learning platform previously to encompass everything. So an LRS is what they call a learning record store. It's basically the thing that can accept xAPI data and xAPI statements. It knows how to interpret all those statements that I outlined at the start of the presentation, whereas an LMS is a broader learning management system. It has all the functions that you would need to enroll users into different content, to kind of manage permissions and report on things, and basically like all the stuff that you typically do in terms of like running a piece of learning against your user base. So the LRS is really just data collection, and the LMS is those broader set of functions. At ClearXP, we encompass both of those. We have an LRS and we have LMS functions built on top of it, but really that's the key difference there. The LMS connects users with content. The LRS is just collecting that data and potentially reporting on it as well. Although it's strictly speaking, LRS doesn't actually have to have reporting functions. Does that clear it up?
And often in terms of interpreting the data, an LRS doesn't by default, like you said, it doesn't just necessarily do that. So some cases from an LRS, you might need some form of dashboard tool plugged in. I know that obviously that's what we do that natively, but if you've got an LRS, it doesn't automatically mean you also have the reporting. That is something that it also needs to be built or integrated in with to an LRS as well.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I'm going to jump across to activities. This is a fun one. Okay, so activity design. So when you're tracking things, it's all focused on activities because you're tracking yourself or someone else doing something against an activity. And they're quite broad. I mean, people ask like, what is an activity? And the answer is it's everything. It's literally everything. Anything can be an activity. When people join my company, I always say, the first thing I say to them with xAPI is like, everything is an activity. And the more you think about it, the more true it is. You can see some examples there. Like when it comes to tracking data, activities can be digital, which is the most kind of obvious logical step, right? You're tracking someone completing a learning module, you're tracking them like earning a qualification, you're tracking them accessing a screen with that module or answering a question on the screen, as well as like interact with videos and images. It's a very natural kind of thing to do. Someone going through a digital learning content, tracking the things that they do within it. It could also be physical, like, so you can track someone doing, and this is also something that xAPI has introduced, you can track someone doing something in the real world. And so your activity is just a representation of that physical object. So I read a book, the book itself isn't digital, or it could be, I mean, if you were reading something on your Kindle. But if you read it in the real life and had some mechanism for collecting that data, the book is just a representation of a physical thing. And the kind of the key examples we see here is like someone doing like, practical training on say like a forklift or a CPI dummy, and then us collecting the data on how well they performed on that physical device. So in those cases, the activity is like, it's the CPI dummy, it's the forklift, it's the thing in the real world that we're kind of tracking success against. It can also be a physical location. If you perform something in like, I went to a meeting someplace in New York could be the activity, right? I went to New York, or I attended a webinar from New York. Those are all activities, and they can all be reported on separately. Getting a bit like more vague is like activities could be conceptual. So it could be you like earning a skill, or, you know, leveling up in a competency, or, you know, achieving a learning objective. It could be you assigning a task to someone else, earning points or badges. You know, it could be you applying for a job, you know, getting a promotion. In these cases, like, yeah, the activity is something which is not physical or digital. It's just like a concept. But it's interesting when you start to like relate that data with back to learning contents. So you can say that, hey, you know, I earned this qualification and now I got promoted in my job, and we can start to tie the tracking between learning with things that are happening in the real world. So they can be quite narrow, but they can be extremely broad as well. Things get like something that's like important to note is that like activities are usually something that like you can, as a learner, you're aware that you are interacting with it. We know we're attending a masterclass right now, but we're not really so aware of all the things that are happening within the masterclass. So we call these internal activities. It's the difference between something that you're enrolled into and launching versus things that are tracked that make up that broader activity. So you can see here in this diagram, I've got digital assets as my internal activities, as well as the concepts. And all of these things make up the masterclass. So earlier, everyone interacted with a poll, right? Our xAPI data can say that Andrew answered the poll, and that belongs to the masterclass webinar. It could be people posting messages to the chat. It could be people interacting with the meeting controls, muting themselves or unmuting themselves. And then our activities can also be the concepts that everyone's learning about today. So it could be everyone learned about xAPI packaging earlier. So we can track that, and we can say that all belongs to the webinar. So that's the difference between the webinar being something that people are consciously attending versus all the parts that make it up. So what's really important is building the relationships between activities, because if we just collected these data in isolation, we wouldn't really know that when Andrew answered that poll, like, did he just do it out there in the world somewhere, or did he do it as part of something else? And so that's where we bring context back in. We say that the poll belonged to the masterclass. And it's important that these relationships always happen at the statement level, because if we were to say that this poll belongs to the masterclass always, like at the activity level, it means that it's fully self-contained. Like, you would not be able to answer the poll in some other context. And that's kind of the power of xAPI, is that activities are not self-contained within their kind of like the learning content. They can travel. So you can ask the same questions in completely different environments and get different results, and start to analyze whether, if I asked this poll as part of masterclass, did I get different results to whether I asked it on our website, for example. And so that's kind of the power of, you know, testing questions under different contexts and then tracking what's most effective. So an example of that is, I mean, from the conceptual level is that if we take activity design as something we're learning about, we learned about it within the masterclass, or we could have learned about it within an e-learning module. And so this is another example of how activities can be used in different ways. And I think when it comes to those conceptual activities, that's really important to know where skills are getting developed, where people are acquiring most of their learning, and potentially like where it's most effective. And once you start to collect activities and link them to different parents, you basically build this graph of content and knowledge and information where different internal activities belong to different other activities. And it's kind of like, if you think about like a social graph, it's like a social graph, but for your content and your concepts and how they all interlink and relate to each other. And this is kind of where the power of reporting comes in. I mean, well, I should say is one of the challenges of reporting is kind of unwinding this graph and being able to determine where those links are strongest and where they're most effective. And that's kind of where you need like a really good reporting tool. but we won't go into that just yet because I think we're running out of time. Any questions on any of that one? Nothing. I think we have 5 minutes left. We just open the floor to anyone who wants to ask anything. Doesn't even have to be xAPI related. You can just ask for life advice. Nothing from anyone. We're gonna finish up early. Andrew, you're on mute.
I think that everybody's absorbing that information. Like you said, we did go quite detailed, but essentially, we hope that there has been a bit of we've been able to communicate broadly some of the benefits what xAPI can do, and then Dave going into some of the more details of how actually to implement some of the things that you're trying to do. So we'll leave it there for today. Like I said, this is just sort of scratching the surface in many ways about what xAPI can do. But we'll be happy to answer any queries that someone may have. And we'll also take feedback into terms of certain more topics that people like to be able to delve further into and be in touch with what other pearls of wisdom we have to offer.
All right.
So I'd like to thank you again for joining us, and you can be free to go out the rest of your day now.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys. See you.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.
Now we know who's like joined the call but not actually paying attention.